This one. Okay. Hello, welcome to lecture on the American Revolution. And for this, we've got a thesis for this, that with the change in relationship between Britain and her American colonies after the 7 Years' War, neither side was able to or willing to consider the point of view of the other. Instead of a new cooperative compromise, their relationship devolved in an increasingly violent and emotional series of events culminating in the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the war that such a declaration entailed. And the previous lecture talked of the Proclamation Act forbidding the American settlers from moving westward as a way to sort of quiet down unrest between colonists and natives. That plus the tax that was imposed on the Americans really angered and upset the Americans. And the first of the taxes is known as the Stamp Act. And there's going to be a lot of vocab in this one. Don't get caught up in all of the details too much or the dates, right? We're 65 to 76. We're in that time period. But if you were to know one, the Stamp Act is a good one to know. So from Britain's point of view, the war was expensive. The war benefited the Americans by removing a threat to them, the French and their native allies, and therefore the Americans should be willing or should, contribute to the debt that Britain took up as part of that war and to pay a small, inconsequential tax from their point of view. So it's to raise money to pay for the war debts, and it's simply a tax on any printed material, documents, newspapers, playing cards, anything that is printed, you have to get this tax, pay this tax on it, and it'll be stamped. That's why it's called the Stamp Act. England had a similar tax on Englishmen, and theirs was a little bit higher. And so the British thought that this is no problem, it's a small tax, and the Americans won't mind paying for this to be part of the British Empire. Now, from the British point of view, okay, there's the British point of view. From the American point of view, this is a violation of their natural rights, and it's the principle. It's not the tax, which is small. It's that England does not have the right to do this under their thinking. So they would make the argument that they pay taxes, but they pay taxes to their local assemblies, and that they should not have to pay taxes directly to British Parliament across the ocean. And protests quickly break out over this tax. An organization is established called the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams in Boston. He is cousin of John Adams, future president. John is very much involved in all of the protests as well. They harassed government officials. All of the colonial governments were united in opposing this, the local assemblies, and there was a boycott of British goods that was very well organized and quite effective, this boycott. So it hurts British merchants. So the tax is repealed. Britain backs off and they take away the Stamp Act. At the same time, they passed another one called the Declaratory Act, which basically said, okay, we're taking away the Stamp Act, but we do have the right to do it if we wanted to, and that we have the right, as they said, to bind the colonies and the people of America. So they said, okay, America, you've won for now, but we could be back to impose future taxes, and that we have the right to do this. Basically, they're saving face. That's what they're doing. So Britain doesn't listen to the Americans and passes another tax. And this one is the Townshend Act. Now, this one is indirect. As a consumer, you don't see it being paid. It would sort of be added into your prices, sort of like a sales tax. And the British was thinking, well, if the Americans don't really see themselves paying the tax, then they won't mind to it. And this is showing their unwillingness to even listen to the American point of view of taxation and representation. And so the reaction was quite swift and strong again, and the protests and the boycotts get going again, and spinning bees get organized, especially by women. This is a way that they contributed to this, because if they're going to boycott British goods, those are those manufactured goods like textiles. And this is really early in the Industrial Revolution, very, very early, but So much of it is still being manufactured by hand, but it's still being manufactured in Britain. And America does not have the capacity to manufacture their own textiles. So this was a way to get going in this, to get busy manufacturing textiles, something that women took on. Now, it's within this sort of heated emotional rhetoric of, discussions on taxation that we get our first violence. And it's called the Boston Massacre. And we don't need to get too much into the causes and effects, but because of the protests, more British soldiers had been sent to Boston in particular. Boston is the heart of the protests. And these redcoats, or lobsters, as the Americans called them, they're stationed within the city. And they would often be taunted at. And in this case, the mob was throwing snowballs at them and shouting and yelling at them. The soldiers are young, inexperienced. One of them got scared. He heard the word fire, and it was not shouted by his commander, probably by a Bostonian, and he shot. And then the other soldiers freak out and they shoot their rifles as well. And 4 young Boston people fall dead. And the first to fall was an African American. After this, a committee of correspondence is established. Think of it like a line group or a WhatsApp group, a correspondence group, right? There's to organize communication between Boston and Virginia and New York and all the others so that they can better communicate and coordinate their resistance to increasing British presence in the colonies and to protest the taxes. And some famous propaganda comes out of it. This one showing, evil British redcoats shooting on innocent victims. They were arrested, the British soldiers, by the Bostonians. They were put on trial, and they were found innocent under the good lawyer who did it for free, John Adams. And he did it because he respects the law and that everybody has a right to trial. It was a very unpopular thing for him to do, but he believed in the law, and he was able to show that they fired not on orders and under a panic and scared situation. Another one there. So what really happened and the message that many Americans see was very different. So Americans are sort of seeing that the British are being cruel and evil, and things start to get quite emotional. Remember that in our thesis, increasingly violent and emotional. And it's shortly after this that we have the Boston Tea Party, which followed a tax on tea. And keep in mind that this was an attack directly on the British state. The British East India Company, which is very much a part of the sort of British fiscal military structure, this is an attack directly on that infrastructure of the British state, the British nation. And it wasn't just a small amount of tea. We're talking millions and millions of today's dollars being thrown away. And colonists, as you might know the stories, they dressed up as natives and dumped a lot of tea into the harbor. And the reaction, so we see the Americans being very unruly, being violent, destroying property, and from the British point of view, it's a mob mentality that needs to be suppressed and needs to be suppressed fast. And from the British point of view, this is how the British saw the Americans, as violent and attacking of their property and just being an unorganized, disruly mob. And so Britain responds to the Boston Tea Party and the other protests with what the Americans called the Intolerable Acts. This is Britain showing their strength. And the Boston Port Act, you don't need to know these specific names, but just know they closed Boston to trade. And for Massachusetts, well, imagine today, for example, the Chinese government closing Hong Kong harbor, just closing it down, not allowing any trade in or out. It would be akin to that, similar to that. And they put Massachusetts under martial law with a strong-handed governor. The Administration of Justice Act, you sort of see the things there, and the Quebec Act, which had nothing to do with Boston or any of this, just bad timing with this one, where in an effort to control the significant population of French people that are now part of the British Empire in Quebec to the north, to make them sort of happy and not protest, they said to the Catholics there, you can continue to practice your religion. And they extended the border of Quebec into Ohio, which is what the Americans had fought the 7 Years' War for. So they are flabbergasted, shocked that Quebec's border got extended into Ohio, whereas Americans aren't allowed to settle into the region, and infuriated them there. So that's what it would have done there with Quebec, would have been extended all out into this area here, with this area being sort of a buffer zone between the Americans and the French people, and could live there. So Americans are quite furious, right? That emotion coming in with this. And this is when they decide to meet as a group. And really, for the first time, they'd met at the Albany, but not everybody had gone to the Albany plan before the French and Indian War. So this is really the first meeting of all of the colonists, and they're united in their opposition to what Britain has been doing, the taxes, the closing of Boston, all of that. So they meet in Philadelphia, and people who are there are people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin is an old hand there, John Adams, some of these names that should be familiar to you. And so they meet September 1774, and they wrote out a Declaration of Rights. So they put forward their argument of what they believe in and what they would like to see as being the proper new relationship with Britain, and they're looking to have a proper discussion with them. Right? These are educated leaders. They're not the ones being the unruly mob. They're the more distinguished ones who are looking, how can we get a conversation going with Britain? And so they put out their first little bit. And they agree to meet if there's violence, and then there's some violence up in Boston area, and up in the area they're organizing militias, and they're stockpiling weapons. They're preparing for a war, and they call themselves Minutemen because you're supposed to be ready in a minute if called upon. Gage, who is the governor, the sort of dictator that Britain has put in charge of Massachusetts, he makes orders to go and find some of their stores of weapons, and he also had the goal of capturing Sam Adams and John Hancock, two of the leaders, and they get wind that they're coming. The regulars are coming. You might have heard the British are coming, but because the Americans called themselves British, so they wouldn't say the British are coming. They said the regulars are coming. The redcoats, they're coming to get our weapons, and there's a fight, and we get a first pitched battle, known as the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and there's a picture of it there. So this is well before independence, before anybody's even talking about independence, so increasingly violent, increasingly emotional. So they meet again for the second meeting, and this is the important one, the spring of 1775. And what's on the table? Okay, well, first off, independence? No, few people were making this argument. They liked being part of the British Empire. They wanted to continue to be part of the British Empire. They're proud to be members of the British Empire. The thought of leaving is not really there. But John Adams was one pushing for this. And at one point he does actually say maybe this is something that we need to do. At the very least, maybe start preparing for that and maybe even be thinking about that. John Adams is from Massachusetts. He saw the fighting at Lexington and Concord, whereas all the others are not maybe as emotional as he was. He was very emotional during this. But as I said, most can't imagine breaking away. So it's not really on the agenda yet. But they do say maybe we should get ready for an army for fighting. And they nominate George Washington, chosen as a new Continental Army. George Washington is a natural leader. He's the tallest man in the room. He's a very dignified person. He listens more than he speaks, and they made a good choice in him. And they start to think about things like money and foreign affairs. So really what you start to see here is they start acting like a nation. And not one that's declared independence, but they're organizing as if they are a country and preparing for possible fighting with Britain. And in Boston, things just get even worse. There's another Battle of Bunker Hill, and there's shelling of the city of Boston by British warships. And so it's within this atmosphere, the leaders make a final pitch to the King of England, King George III, for some kind of reconciliation, some kind of let's sit down and talk. what they called an olive branch petition, olive branch, a symbol of peace, and to request, an end to the hostilities and a discussion. And it's not even read. And the answer that you receive back is that anybody talking of independence or continues with any protest is committing treason, and you will be hanged. That's the response that the people like Adams and Washington and Benjamin Franklin, that's the response that they get. He rejects it and orders a naval blockade of Boston. And this is going to very much help to push John Adams' argument for independence, and he is helped very much by this little book. Common Sense, as it's called, short book, written by a man called Thomas Paine. He's British but living in the colonies, and it's making forward the Republican argument why monarchy is not sensical, and why a republic makes common sense, and why America should not be ruled by a people on another side of an ocean and should have their independence. And so, written in a very simple language that everybody can understand, extremely popular, well read. If you didn't read it, you knew about his arguments, and it made sense to you. And it's the actions of the British getting increasingly violent, especially against Boston, and their threats to be even stronger in their crackdown on the protests, plus this book, and leads to the Declaration of Independence. Summer of 1776, they asked Thomas Jefferson to write it. He's a good writer, and there's the copy there. And it's based on the ideas of John Locke, and it listed out their complaints. It said people have natural rights, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It says that the people choose to obey government that protect their rights, but that people have the right to resist and overthrow governments that do not protect their rights. And then it's a long list then of all the ways that they feel the British have violated their rights, and sort of ends with, so because of all this, all these things that you've done to not protect our rights and to violate our rights, we therefore are now and forever independent. And then they signed it July 1st to July 4th. They all signed their name. They understand that this means war, and that if they lose the war, well, they'll hang together. Famous photo or painting. It wasn't like this when they signed it. They were all busy in and out. They just signed it when they had time. And then the American people get divided, right? Do you support the war and independence, or do you support Britain and remaining part of the British Empire? And a lot of people sit on the fence. It's sort of like, well, let's see who wins, and maybe not being so obvious with which side. And others, very much, yeah, I'm on the side of America, or I'm on the side of the English. The loyalists, this is what they tended to be, sort of working in the government or more rural areas. They feel maybe Britain will win the war. They're worried about what would replace Britain. Okay, so the question right now is about who's going to govern us. If the Americans win, how will they govern? So they're arguing that Britain is going to protect their rights in the long run. Upper classes with the most to lose, elderly, those associated with the Church of England tend to be more loyal to Britain. And the patriots, they're hoping for better economic opportunities. They can get rid of mercantilism and open up more trade. They're people who are behind the ideas of Republican, or people that are angry at the English, and they're strongest in New England. They tend to be more younger people as well. And now war is going to come, but that's for another lecture. So, recall back to the thesis that with the new relationship, neither side was able to listen to the other, or didn't listen to the other's point of view. They each have their own point of view. If they just sat down and discussed it like men, maybe they could have had a new relationship, but that didn't happen, and things got increasingly emotional, and then they got violent, and even more and more so to the point that neither side is even willing to talk to the other, and the Americans, with those ideas of Enlightenment ideas in the air, Republican ideas in the air, and the events that are going on, make the decision to declare independence. All right, thank you very much for listening.